Psychological acceptability. Usability matters. Opening. The post-it note on the monitor. There is a moment that every security professional has encountered, and it tends to arrive without warning in the middle of an otherwise ordinary site visit or office walkthrough. You're passing a workstation, a finance coordinator, perhaps, or a senior project manager, someone who's been with the organization for 8 years and has never caused a security incident in their life. And there it is, a small yellow square of paper stuck to the bottom corner of the monitor. On it, in ballpoint pen, is a password. Sometimes it is partially obscured by a coffee mug or a plant. Sometimes it is not obscured at all. Sometimes in open-plan offices, you find 3 of them in the same sight line. The instinct, trained into most security professionals by years of awareness campaigns, is to treat this as a behavioral failure. The employee has been told not to write passwords down. The acceptable use policy says not to write passwords down. The annual security training module, which they clicked through and completed, explicitly covered the risk of written credentials. And yet here is the password on a post-it note for anyone in the room to read. But ask a different question. Ask why the password is on the note. The answer is almost always the same. The password is 20 characters long, mandated to contain uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and 2 special characters, and it must be changed every 30 days. The employee has 12 different systems to access in the course of their workday, each with its own password, each with its own reset cycle. Their working memory is fully occupied with their actual job, processing invoices, managing project timelines, coordinating logistics. The cognitive capacity available for remembering and entering 20-character rotating passwords is genuinely insufficient for the volume of passwords the security policy requires them to manage. The post-it note is not a behavioral failure. It is a design failure wearing the appearance of a behavioral failure. The security control, the 20-character rotating password, was designed to be cryptographically strong. It was not designed to be humanly usable. And because it was not designed to be humanly usable, the employee invented a workaround that is both more convenient and substantially more dangerous than a well-designed control would have been. They did not intend to create a vulnerability. The vulnerability was created by the design, not by them. This is what psychological acceptability means as a security principle. It is the recognition that a security control exists not in a specification document, but in the behavior of the people who are required to use it. A control that is so difficult, so frustrating, or so cognitively demanding that users find ways around it is not a strong control with a compliance problem. It is a failed control. The bypass is not the failure. The bypass is the symptom. The design is the failure. Understanding that distinction and building the discipline to pursue good design rather than simply tightening enforcement is what this session is entirely about. The foundation, what the principle actually claims. Psychological acceptability is one of the 8 design principles for secure systems articulated by Salzer and Schroeder in 1975. The principle states that security mechanisms should be designed so that they interfere as little as possible with the user's ability to do their work. More precisely, the protection system's interface should be designed to make it easy for users to act in ways that are consistent with the protection goals and difficult for them to act in ways that are not. That formulation is precise and worth holding on to. It does not say that security should be invisible. It does not say that users should be allowed to do whatever is convenient. It says that the design of the protection system should make the secure path, the path that produces the outcome security requires, the path of least resistance. When the secure path requires more effort than the insecure alternative, the design has failed the principle regardless of how strong the cryptographic or technical specification is. The human element is frequently described as the weakest link in security. This framing is misleading because it locates the weakness in the person rather than in the design. A person who writes their password on a Post-it note is not weak. They are rational. They are responding to a constraint, the cognitive demand of managing many complex passwords with the most effective tool available to them in their immediate environment, which is a piece of paper. The weakness is in the design that created a cognitive demand exceeding what any reasonable person could sustain without a workaround. The question is never why do people bypass security controls. The question is always what made the bypass more viable than the approved path. The governance layer that produces psychologically unacceptable controls has a specific failure mode worth naming. Policies are written by people who understand the security requirement but do not experience the daily operational burden of the control. A password policy written by a security team who use password managers and single sign-on in their own workflows and who are accustomed to thinking in terms of cryptographic strength rather than daily user experience, will optimize for the cryptographic requirement without weighing the operational demand. The policy produces a specification that is technically correct and humanly unsustainable. The acceptable use policy deserves particular examination through this lens. An AUP is the foundational governance artifact that defines what employees may and may not do with organizational technology. Most AUPs are written in legal language, run to several thousand words, and are presented to employees during onboarding through a system that requires a scroll and a click to acknowledge. The click is logged. The understanding is not. An AUP written to be read and understood rather than acknowledged and filed is a different document from one written to satisfy a compliance requirement. It uses plain language. It explains the rationale for each restriction rather than just stating the restriction. It distinguishes between absolute prohibitions and guidelines that require judgment. It is short enough to read in a single sitting. Most AUPs are not written this way, and the consequence is that employees acknowledge terms they did not read and later violate restrictions they were not genuinely aware of. The tension at the heart of psychological acceptability is a real and persistent one. Strong security frequently requires behavior that is inconvenient, time-consuming, or cognitively demanding. Multi-factor authentication requires an additional step at every login. Data classification requires employees to make a judgment call about every document they create. Phishing awareness requires sustained skepticism about every email they receive. These demands are real. The question is not whether to impose them, but how to design them so that the overhead they impose is as small as it can be while still achieving the security objective. The history of security technology over the past decade is largely a history of decoupling security strength from user friction through better design. Biometric authentication is more secure than most passwords and requires less user effort than any password. Single sign-on is more secure than 12 separate passwords and requires significantly less effort to manage. Passkeys, built on the FIDO2 standard, are more resistant to phishing than SMS-based one-time passwords and require less cognitive load from the user. In each case, better design produced an outcome that is simultaneously stronger as a security control and easier for the user. The friction curve was not just navigated but moved. The security professional who understands this has a different response to usability complaints than the one who treats the trade-off as fixed. When a business unit reports that the approved file sharing system is too slow to use in client meetings, the first question is not how do we enforce compliance with a slow system. It is what is making the system slow, and can that be fixed without reducing the security properties that made us choose the system? When employees complain that the VPN drops connections frequently on hotel networks, the question is not how do we enforce VPN usage despite the reliability problem. It is why is the VPN unreliable on hotel networks? And can that be fixed so that the VPN is both secure and usable? The bypass behavior that follows when friction is too high is not merely a compliance problem. It is a visibility problem. When an employee uses personal cloud storage to share work documents because the corporate system is too slow, the organization does not just lose the security property of the corporate system. It loses visibility entirely. The data moves through a channel the organization does not monitor, to storage the organization does not control, using authentication the organization cannot revoke. A slow but monitored file sharing system is measurably safer than an unmonitored workaround, even if the workaround is technically convenient. A lockout policy that triggers after 3 failed login attempts and locks the account for 4 hours achieves the security goal of slowing brute force attacks. It also creates a situation where any employee who misremembers a recently changed password, who types too quickly and makes an error, or whose device sends cached credentials after a password change will find their account locked at exactly the moment they need it. The help desk queue fills with lockout requests. Employees who have been locked out once learn that the lockout policy is a hazard and develop workarounds. They save their passwords in their browser. They use simpler passwords that are less likely to be mistyped. They share accounts with colleagues so they can keep working while the locked account is being reset. Each workaround is a security regression produced by a policy that was designed for the brute force threat without considering the human error reality. The design that balances these concerns is not a weaker policy. It is a policy calibrated to the realistic threat model rather than the worst-case theoretical one. A lockout threshold of 10 failed attempts, with a soft lockout of 5 minutes before automatically unlocking, blocks brute force attacks that attempt thousands of passwords per hour while being invisible to legitimate users who occasionally mistype. Combined with anomaly detection that flags unusual login patterns, hundreds of attempts in seconds, attempts from unexpected geographic locations, attempts at unusual hours, the security outcome is comparable to or better than the aggressive lockout policy, with none of the friction that produces workarounds. The architecture, designing the secure path as the easy path. The architectural expression of psychological acceptability in a modern enterprise environment has 4 components that must be designed, deployed, and maintained in coordination. They are not independent controls. They are a system, and the system's effectiveness depends on each component reinforcing the others. The first component is the authentication architecture. Authentication is the most friction-laden interaction most users have with security every day, and it is the interaction where poor design causes the most damaging workarounds. An authentication architecture designed for psychological acceptability starts with single sign-on as the foundation. One strong authentication against a central identity provider, with the resulting session token accepted by every application in the environment without requiring the user to re-authenticate. The user authenticates once with whatever the strongest acceptable factor is, and the SSO infrastructure handles all subsequent application access transparently. SSO does not reduce security. It concentrates it. The organization is trading 12 mediocre per application passwords for one strong central authentication event, which is a security improvement as well as a usability improvement. The investment in hardening the identity provider, the FIDO2-based authenticator, the biometric option, the hardware token for privileged users, the anomaly detection on the login event, pays off across every application in the environment because every application benefits from that one strong authentication. Passkeys represent the current frontier of this design direction. A passkey is a cryptographic credential stored on the user's device, bound to a specific service and authenticated through whatever the device's natural authentication mechanism is: biometric, PIN, device unlock. The user presses their thumb to their phone and they are authenticated. There is no password to remember, no OTP to read from secondary device, no phishing-susceptible knowledge factor to intercept. The security properties are stronger than most current MFA implementations. Passkeys are phishing-resistant by cryptographic design, not just by user training, and the user experience is the simplest possible interaction with authentication technology. The second component is the reporting and communication architecture. If employees are to function as human sensors, identifying and reporting suspicious emails, flagging unusual requests, surfacing potential security concerns before they become incidents, the design of the reporting mechanism determines how many of them actually do it. A reporting mechanism that requires the user to compose a new email, remember the correct reporting address, include specific information in a specific format, and wait for a response that may or may not come is a mechanism that will be used rarely. The friction is too high for the perceived benefit, especially when the employee is not certain the email is actually suspicious and does not want to waste the security team's time. A single-click report button, integrated directly into the email client, collapses the entire process to one action. The user does not need to know the reporting address, compose a message, or decide what information to include. All of that is handled automatically by the integration. The security team receives the submission with all necessary metadata. The user receives an acknowledgement within minutes and a verdict within hours. The feedback loop transforms the experience from a one-way act of compliance into a two-way interaction that rewards the user's vigilance with visible information and thanks. The mechanism that is easy to use gets used. The mechanism that requires effort does not. The third component is the training architecture. Security awareness training designed for psychological acceptability is not a compliance exercise delivered once a year and checked off a list. It is a continuous, varied, specific, and feedback-rich program that creates behavioral habits rather than knowledge inventories. The distinction matters because knowledge does not reliably produce behavior under stress. An employee who knows that phishing emails are dangerous and can describe 3 characteristics of a phishing attempt in a quiz will not necessarily recognize a phishing email on a Monday morning when they are tired, running late, and reading through 42 messages in their inbox. Knowledge is a necessary condition for good security behavior. It is not a sufficient one. Behavioral habit is built through repetition with feedback in conditions that approximate the real situation. Spaced phishing simulations, varied in template, varied in timing, delivered unpredictably rather than quarterly, build the reflexive pattern recognition that classroom training cannot. The critical design element is the feedback at the moment of failure. When an employee clicks a simulated phishing link, the training delivered at that exact moment has a significantly higher retention rate than training delivered a week later in a separate module. The just-in-time intervention connects the educational content to the specific mistake in the employee's immediate memory, which is the most favorable condition for learning. The fourth component is the feedback and recognition architecture, a security program that communicates with employees only through policy documents, compliance reminders, and incident notifications is a program that the employees experience as an obstacle to their work rather than as a resource for it. Positive reinforcement, recognizing and thanking employees who report suspicious emails, who surface security concerns, who complete training ahead of schedule, who suggest improvements to security processes, changes the psychological position of security from external constraint to shared goal. The employee who reported a phishing email and received a personalized thank you from the security team, noting specifically that their report allowed the team to block a campaign that might have affected their colleagues, has experienced security participation as rewarding rather than burdensome. That experience is more durable than any policy. Tools that reduce friction without reducing security. 4 tools deserve examination through the lens of which specific usability problem each one solves, what it costs to deploy and operate, and where it leaves gaps that must be addressed through other means. Single sign-on addresses, authentication fatigue. The accumulation of separate login events across many applications that creates the daily friction most strongly associated with security overhead. A user who must authenticate to 12 separate systems in the course of a workday, each with a unique credential and potentially a separate MFA prompt, experiences authentication as a constant interruption. The cognitive overhead of managing the credential set, remembering which password belongs to which systems have active sessions, which sessions are about to expire, is real and measurable. SSO consolidates those 12 authentication events into one, backed by a strong central authentication that applies to all downstream applications. The cost of SSO is the infrastructure complexity of the identity provider and the integration work required for each application to support SAML or OIDC-based federation. Legacy applications that predate standardized authentication protocols require additional integration effort. LDAP proxy adapters, reverse proxy authentication wrappers, or in some cases custom application code changes. An organization that has 50 applications and wants to apply SSO to all of them will find that roughly 30 are straightforward integrations and 20 require varying degrees of custom work. The cost of that work is real and must be planned for. The limitation of SSO is the single point of failure it creates. A compromised identity provider session or a compromised identity provider itself has implications across every federated application simultaneously. Hardening the identity provider, strong MFA, anomaly detection, session timeout policies, privileged access separation is not optional when SSO is the authentication foundation. Biometrics, specifically device-native biometrics like fingerprint and facial recognition integrated into the device authentication layer, solve the knowledge factor problem entirely. A password is a knowledge factor, something the user knows, which means something the user must remember, recall accurately, and type correctly under conditions of time pressure and cognitive load. A fingerprint or a face is an inherence factor, something the user is, which means the authentication gesture is the same whether the user is tired, distracted, or in a hurry. The experience of authentication collapses from a cognitive task to a physical one, and the physical task is one the user performs dozens of times a day for every device interaction. The friction essentially disappears. The cost of biometrics is hardware. Devices must have biometric sensors, which represents a capital cost for organizations that are refreshing endpoint hardware. The limitation of biometrics is more subtle and worth understanding precisely. Biometric factors cannot be rotated. A password that is compromised can be changed. A fingerprint that is enrolled in a biometric system cannot be changed. The user has a finite number of biometric options, and if a biometric template is compromised in a database breach, that template represents a permanent vulnerability. This is why biometrics are correctly understood as a username, a way to identify who is presenting themselves, more than a password. They work securely as part of a multi-factor system where the device itself is a second factor, something you have, not as a standalone credential. Passkeys built on the FIDO2 standard represent the most significant recent advance in the usability security balance for authentication. A passkey is a public-private key pair where the private key never leaves the user's device and authentication is performed through the device's local authentication mechanism, biometric or PIN. The authentication gesture is simple. The security properties are strong. Passkeys are phishing resistant because the private key is bound to the specific origin that created it and will not authenticate to a spoofed site, even a convincingly cloned one. They are credential stuffing resistant because there is no shared secret to harvest from a server breach. The server stores only a public key, and compromise of that public key provides no authentication capability. The cost of passkeys is ecosystem dependency. The authentication provider, the device OS, and the browser or application must all support the FIDO2 standard for the end-to-end experience to work. Legacy enterprise applications, applications running in managed environments with restricted browser capabilities, and applications that have not been updated to support modern authentication standards will not support passkey enrollment. These applications require bridge solutions, password managers, or SSO integration that maintain the convenience for the user while the application is updated or replaced. The timeline for full passkey adoption in a heterogeneous enterprise environment is measured in years, not quarters, and the transition architecture must account for the applications that are last to migrate. A self-service password reset system addresses a specific and high-volume usability failure. The password reset help desk call. In an organization where employees manage many passwords, each rotating on its own cycle, the rate of reset requests is a direct function of how many passwords are in the system and how frequently they must change. A help desk agent who spends 30% of their day handling password resets is neither performing their intended function nor building the technical skills that the security function needs. The employee who must wait 2 hours for a password reset to proceed with time-sensitive work experiences security as a direct obstacle to their productivity. Self-service password reset allows employees to verify their identity, typically through a combination of pre-registered questions, a secondary email or phone, or an existing active device, and reset their own credential without a help desk interaction. The cost of self-service password reset is the identity verification mechanism it uses. A self-service system that verifies identity through 3 knowledge questions is a system that can be bypassed by anyone with access to the target social media profile, where many of those questions' answers are publicly available. The security of the self-service system is only as strong as the identity verification it performs. The correct design uses a second factor that the attacker cannot easily obtain: an enrollment at a known device, a biometric verification, or a separate communication channel, rather than knowledge questions that are answers to questions people post on the internet. Implementation: building systems that users will actually use. 2 implementation scenarios expose the practical complexity of applying psychological acceptability to controls that are technically well understood but humanly difficult to sustain. The first is implementing an account lockout policy that actually balances security and usability. The technical parameters of a lockout policy, the attempt threshold, the observation window, the lockout duration, and the reset mechanism, interact with the human reality of how users behave. The common mistake is to derive parameters from the threat model. A brute force attack attempts thousands of passwords per second, so a 3-attempt threshold will stop it, without modeling the false lockout rate, which is the rate at which legitimate users trigger the lockout through normal error. The implementation process begins with measurement, not configuration. Pull the authentication failure logs for the current environment for a 30-day period. Classify the failure events. What percentage occur in bursts of hundreds within seconds? Likely brute force or credential stuffing? What percentage occur in small clusters of 2 to 5 within a few minutes? Likely user error, mistyped password, wrong account. And what percentage occur as isolated single failures? Likely cached credentials from a previous device. The classification tells you what the actual threat distribution looks like in your environment and what the impact of different thresholds would be on each category. For most enterprise environments, the data reveals that user error failures are dramatically more common than brute force failures. A 3-attempt threshold will lock out a meaningful percentage of legitimate users every day. A user who hits the lockout and receives a message that says, "Account locked. Contact your IT administrator," has no information about how long they need to wait, whether they could try again, or what caused the lockout. A message that says, "Too many attempts. Please try again in 5 minutes," or "Reset your password using the self-service link below," converts the lockout from a dead end into a managed experience. The user knows exactly what to do, can do it without a help desk call, and experiences the security control as helpful rather than obstructive. The second implementation scenario is the internal suspicious email reporting mechanism, the phishing report button. The design of this mechanism determines not just whether employees report suspicious emails, but whether the security team learns anything useful from the reports they receive. A report button that dumps all submissions into a shared inbox that is triaged manually once a day is not a reporting mechanism that scales. An inbox that receives 300 submissions on the day a phishing campaign hits the organization will not be processed in time to prevent additional clicks from employees who are still receiving the same campaign. The reporting infrastructure must be designed for the volume it will receive under the conditions when it matters most. The implementation has 3 layers. The front end is the integration into the email client, an add-in button, visually prominent, 1 click to submit. The metadata submitted with the button click should include the full email headers, the sending IP, the full body and attachment hashes, and the timestamp of the click. None of this should require the employee to do anything beyond pressing the button. The middle layer is the automated triage. Upon submission, the reported email is immediately checked against threat intelligence feeds, URL reputation services, and the organization's known good center list. The triage assigns a preliminary classification: likely malicious, likely benign, unknown, and routes accordingly. Reports classified as likely malicious are escalated to an analyst queue immediately. Reports classified as likely benign generate an automated response to the reporter within minutes. The back layer is the feedback loop. Every submission receives a response, and the response is specific to the verdict. A reporter who learns that their submission was an active phishing campaign and that the security team has blocked it for the rest of the organization has experienced reporting as consequential and worthwhile. They will report again. The governance surrounding the implementation must address the false reporting rate. Employees who report legitimate marketing emails, newsletter subscriptions, or their own colleagues' internal communications as suspicious. A false report is not a failure. It is evidence of an alert employee who erred on the side of caution, and the response should reinforce the behavior. A brief, friendly note explaining that the submission was a legitimate email, rather than discouraging it. The goal is a culture where every suspicious email is reported and the false positive rate is accepted as the cost of that culture, because the alternative, employees deciding for themselves what is and is not worth reporting, produces a much lower signal rate. When usability fails, 3 scenarios. 3 troubleshooting scenarios illuminate the distinct ways that psychological acceptability failures surface in practice and what the diagnostic process reveals about the underlying design. The first scenario involves employees who are writing complex passwords on Post-it notes and leaving them visible on their monitors. The security team's initial response is a policy reminder and a strongly worded note to managers. The behavior continues. The compliance team escalates. The behavior continues. A second training module is added to the annual curriculum. The behavior continues. The diagnostic does not begin with the employees. It begins with the password policy itself. Pull the exact parameters: character length requirement, complexity requirement, rotation frequency, and the number of systems each employee manages. For a 20-character policy with a 30-day rotation across 12 systems, the calculation of what the policy demands from the employee's working memory is straightforward and damning. The employee needs to maintain, recall accurately, and change on a staggered schedule effectively 440 characters of random-seeming text per year. This is not a security culture problem. It is a cognitive load problem, and no amount of training or enforcement will change the fundamental mismatch between what the policy demands and what human memory can sustainably provide. The fix begins with the NIST SP 800-63B guidance, which current security practice has largely validated. Password length matters more than complexity. Rotation on a fixed schedule is counterproductive. It produces predictable patterns, not strong passwords, and rotation should be triggered by suspected compromise rather than by calendar. The new policy sets a 12 to 15 character minimum, removes mandatory complexity requirements in favor of a check against known compromised passwords, and eliminates the 30-day rotation requirement entirely. Simultaneously, a password manager is deployed and enrollment is made a required step in onboarding. The employee creates one strong master passphrase, and the password manager generates and stores unique credentials for every system. Biometric device authentication, Windows Hello or equivalent, is enabled so that access to the password manager's autofill function requires only a fingerprint rather than a typed passphrase. 6 months after implementation, the Post-it notes are gone. The help desk reset volume has fallen substantially, and the average password entropy across the organization is higher than it was under the complex rotation policy, because the password manager is generating genuinely random credentials rather than the predictable patterns that rotation pressure produces. The second scenario involves a critical alert that was not actioned for 12 hours because it was buried in a queue of 800 lower severity alerts. During those 12 hours, an attacker who had established an initial foothold moved laterally and gained access to a server containing sensitive customer data. The post-incident review includes the phrase the analyst should have prioritized this alert in its findings. The diagnostic challenges that framing. Pull the analyst's queue for the 12-hour period and examine the alert composition. If the analyst received 800 alerts in 12 hours, they were processing one alert every approximately 54 seconds to clear the queue. Not enough time to investigate, correlate, or reason carefully about any single alert. Expecting the analyst to correctly prioritize a high-severity alert buried in hundreds of low-severity ones is expecting a human being to perform a task that is genuinely beyond reliable human performance at that frequency and volume. The finding should not be that the analyst failed. The finding should be that the system was designed in a way that made analyst success impossible. The alert volume problem is a CM tuning problem, an enrichment problem, and a prioritization problem simultaneously. The tuning work examines the 800 alerts and classifies them. What percentage are generated by known benign sources, internal scanners, approved monitoring tools, scheduled maintenance tasks, that could be suppressed without any loss of security signal? What percentage are low-severity informational events that should be logged but not alerted? What percentage represent real signals that require analyst attention? In most environments, this analysis reveals that 50 to 80% of alert volume is suppressible without meaningful loss of coverage. The analyst who was processing 800 alerts could be processing 160, which is a number that allows genuine investigation rather than triage theater. The enrichment work adds context to each alert before it reaches the analyst. Asset criticality, threat intelligence correlation, historical behavior baseline for the affected entity, geolocation and timing anomalies, so that the analyst's prioritization decision is informed by relevant context rather than made on the basis of the alert's raw title. An alert that arrives saying failed authentication requires significant investigation to understand its significance. An alert that arrives saying failed authentication, privileged account, third attempt, source IP flagged by 3 threat intelligence feeds, outside normal working hours, asset, domain controller, has communicated its significance immediately. The analyst can prioritize correctly in 5 seconds rather than 5 minutes. The third scenario involves employees using personal cloud storage, consumer Dropbox, Google Drive, personal OneDrive accounts for Word documents because the corporate file sharing system is slow and requires VPN authentication that drops frequently on external networks. The DLP system has flagged hundreds of policy violations. The security team has escalated to HR. The escalations have had no effect. The diagnostic begins with the user experience of the corporate system. Arrange to use it as an employee would from a hotel network with the devices employees actually use. Try to share a large presentation file on a deadline. Measure the actual time from initiating the share to having the link ready to send. If that time is 4 minutes and the personal alternative takes 30 seconds, the policy violation is not a compliance mystery. It is a rational response to a 4-to-1 efficiency ratio. No enforcement mechanism will reliably redirect behavior when the enforcement creates an outcome that employees experience as materially worse. The fix is in the system, not in the employees. Investigate why the corporate system is slow on external networks. Is it the VPN overhead, the geographic location of the file servers relative to where employees travel, the lack of a content delivery layer for large files, the authentication handshake latency? Each cause has a different technical fix. A split-tunnel VPN configuration that sends only traffic bound for corporate resources through the tunnel, rather than all internet traffic, dramatically reduces VPN overhead and improves connection reliability. A CDN layer in front of the file sharing service reduces download time for commonly accessed files to near local speeds. A mobile-optimized authentication flow that uses device-native authentication rather than a web-form VPN credential reduces the authentication friction for employees on mobile devices. After the technical fixes are deployed, communicate them to employees in terms of the specific problems the fixes address. We heard that the file sharing system was slow on external networks. We have made changes that reduce download time for large files and improve VPN reliability on hotel and conference networks. Please let us know if you experience further performance problems. This communication accomplishes two things. It demonstrates that the security team listens and acts on usability feedback. The security awareness manager's defining problem is the engagement gap, the measurable distance between the security behaviors the program aims to produce and the behaviors the organization actually exhibits. The engagement gap shows up in low training completion rates, persistently high phishing simulation click rates, low suspicious email report rates, and then formal feedback from employees who describe security training as something they do to satisfy a requirement rather than something they find genuinely useful. The manager who treats the engagement gap as a compliance problem, who responds by adding another mandatory module, sending reminder emails, and escalating non-completers to their managers, will close the compliance metric while leaving the behavioral gap entirely intact. The manager's specific moment is the conversation with a department head who refuses to participate in mandatory security awareness training, calling it irrelevant to their role. The first diagnostic question is whether the training is genuinely irrelevant. If the curriculum was designed for individual contributors, it explains how to recognize phishing emails and how to use the password manager, and the department head's actual security exposure is entirely different. They have administrative authority over financial systems. They're targeted for executive impersonation scams. Their procurement decisions carry third-party vendor risk. Then the training is irrelevant. Requiring them to sit through irrelevant training is not good security practice. It is a demonstration that the program was not designed with their role in mind, which they will communicate to their team. The correct response is to design a separate curriculum for senior leaders that addresses their actual threat profile. Spear phishing and executive impersonation, the security implications of procurement decisions, their role in establishing the security culture for their team, and the governance decisions they make that affect the organization's security posture. A department head who experiences security training as directly relevant to the challenges of their actual role will not only complete it, but will apply it. The compliance outcome and the behavioral outcome become the same outcome. The SOC analyst at L2 or L3 level experiences psychological acceptability as alert fatigue, the erosion of analytical quality that occurs when the volume of alerts exceeds the analyst's capacity to engage with each one meaningfully. Alert fatigue is not a motivational failure. It is a cognitive failure produced by a design failure. When the analyst's queue contains 600 alerts during a 12-hour shift, the system is asking them to make 600 independent assessment decisions at an average of 72 seconds per alert. At that frequency, the analytical process, gather context, check correlations, assess severity, decide action, cannot be performed. What happens instead is pattern matching on alert titles and source categories, which is reliable for the cases the analyst has seen before and unreliable for the novel cases that are most likely to be genuine incidents. The analyst's performance is not the lever to pull. The alert volume is the lever. The analyst who is processing 100 well-enriched, properly deduplicated alerts per shift is performing genuine analysis. The analyst processing 600 raw alerts per shift is performing triage theater. The investment in CM tuning, enrichment pipelines, and alert deduplication that reduces volume by 80% while increasing the proportion of actionable signals is an investment in the security outcome, not just in analyst well-being, though it is also that. The security architect encounters psychological acceptability as a design constraint that operates at every layer of the systems they build. The principle that security is a user experience problem, not in the soft sense of making security pleasant, but in the hard engineering sense that design determines behavior, shapes every architectural decision from the authentication model through the data classification system, through the network access design. An architect who understands this designs the three-tier application so that developers can deploy new services into the correct security tier without needing to understand the firewall rules they are implicitly joining. They design the data classification system so that the classification decision for a new document is surfaced at the moment of creation, with clear defaults and simple options, rather than as a retroactive obligation. The architect's specific measure of success is the rate at which the security controls they design are used as intended, without workarounds. A control that is bypassed at a high rate was not built correctly for the people who were supposed to use it. The architect's responsibility does not end at the technical specification. It extends to validating, through observation and measurement, that the deployed control produces the behavior it was designed for. Case scenario: the password policy that made everything worse. You are the security lead at a professional services firm with 300 employees spread across 6 offices. The firm handles client financial data, legal documents, and confidential strategic plans. 18 months ago, the CISO, since departed, implemented a password policy recommended by an external auditor. 20-character minimum, mandatory complexity, 60-day rotation, applied to every system and application in the environment. The auditor's report rated the policy as a significant security improvement. The compliance checkbox was satisfactorily filled. The reality, visible in the data you pull when you begin your review, is a different picture. Help desk password reset requests have tripled compared to the period before the policy was implemented. The help desk team is spending 35% of their time on password resets, time they were previously spending on infrastructure maintenance, endpoint management, and the system upgrades that have been delayed as a result. 2 walkthroughs of the office floors have documented post-it notes at 8 workstations. A DLP alert review reveals a pattern of employees emailing work files to personal accounts before the password rotation cycle, apparently to avoid losing access during the transition window when old passwords expire and new ones have not yet been fully propagated across all systems. 3 employees in the past 6 months have had their accounts compromised through credential stuffing. The credentials were from a public breach of an external service where the employees had reused variations of their corporate password pattern, which the rotation pressure had trained them to build. The constraint that governs your remediation is that the firm is under a client audit in 4 months that will examine their security controls against a framework that includes password policy requirements. The audit framework references minimum password length and complexity, but does not specify a rotation cadence. You have 4 months to change the policy, deploy new tooling, demonstrate measurable improvement, and prepare documentation that satisfies the audit framework's requirements without the rotation requirement that is causing the compliance theater. Your first action is the policy change itself. You revise the password policy to align with NIST SP 800-63B. Minimum 15 characters, no mandatory complexity requirements beyond a check against a list of known compromised passwords. Rotation required only when a compromise is suspected or confirmed, and a mandatory password manager for all employees. The policy document is rewritten in plain language, explaining the rationale for each change. We are removing the 60-day rotation requirement because research, including guidance from NIST, the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, shows that forced rotation leads employees to use predictable patterns rather than strong, unique passwords. We are requiring longer passwords because length is the primary determinant of password strength. The policy document is 2 pages, not 12. Your second action is the tooling deployment. You select an enterprise password manager with SSO integration, browser extension support for all approved browsers, and a mobile app. You work with the IT team to pre-enroll every employee device so that the password manager is already installed and configured before the rollout communication goes out. You configure the password manager to integrate with the identity provider so that the master password manager unlock is tied to the same biometric authentication as the SSO session. On devices with biometric support, the employee's fingerprint unlocks both the SSO session and the password manager simultaneously. The target user experience for the majority of daily work is touch fingerprint sensor. Everything is accessible. The deployment is sequenced by department. You start with the IT and security team themselves, both because they can troubleshoot and because deploying to a group of informed users first surfaces the edge cases before they hit the general population. After 2 weeks, you roll out to the finance and legal departments with dedicated in-person briefings explaining the change, demonstrating the new experience, and answering questions. You schedule these briefings during team meetings that already exist rather than creating a new calendar obligation. The remaining departments receive the rollout over the following 6 weeks, with department-specific champions, volunteers from the first wave who can answer peer questions, available throughout. The communication strategy throughout the rollout emphasizes what employees are gaining rather than what is changing. You will no longer need to remember or rotate complex passwords. The new system does that for you. Login will be faster and simpler on devices with fingerprint sensors. You will never need to call the help desk for a password reset. The self-service system handles it in under 2 minutes. This framing is both accurate and motivating. The security improvement is real. The password manager is generating genuinely random 25-character credentials for every system, which are dramatically stronger than the predictable patterns the rotation pressure was producing. The user experience improvement is equally real, and communicating it honestly is not marketing spin. It is an accurate description of what the design achieves. 4 months after the initial rollout, the metrics you present to the client audit tell a coherent story. Help desk password reset requests have dropped by 71% from the post-policy implementation peak, returning to near pre-policy levels and freeing the help desk team for the infrastructure work that had been deferred. No new post-it note sightings have been documented in 2 office walkthroughs. The DLP alerts for work files sent to personal email accounts, which have been a proxy signal for password rotation anxiety, have fallen by 63%. The Password Manager's Vault audit shows that the average credential length stored for employee accounts is 27 characters, significantly longer than the previous policy's 20-character minimum, and that all stored credentials pass a known compromise password check. At the audit, the reviewer examines the policy and the evidence package. They note the absence of a rotation cadence and ask about it. Your response walks them through the NIST guidance, provides the internal data showing the credential stuffing incidents that occurred under the rotation regime, and explains that your policy triggers rotation on suspected compromise rather than on calendar. The reviewer accepts this and notes in their assessment that the firm's password policy reflects current security best practice. The audit finding is favorable. The lesson the scenario teaches, stated plainly, is that the policy the auditor recommended 18 months ago was not wrong because the auditor was incompetent. It was wrong because it optimized for a security specification, 20 characters, complex, rotating, without modeling the behavioral consequences of those specifications in a realistic human environment. A 20-character rotating password is stronger than a 15-character static one in a laboratory where the human user is infinitely patient and never develops shortcuts. In the actual environment where people work, distracted, time-pressured, managing dozens of credentials simultaneously, the rotating policy produces patterns, workarounds, and reuse that make the overall security posture worse than a well-designed static policy with supporting tooling would produce. Psychological acceptability is not a compromise of the security requirement. It is the requirement. A control that people cannot sustainably use is not a control. Closing. Designed for the person who exists, not the person you wish existed. Every security policy that has failed to produce the behavior it was designed for contains, somewhere in its architecture, an assumption about the people who would follow it that turn out to be wrong. The assumption is rarely malicious. It is usually something more ordinary, an assumption that people have unlimited working memory for security credentials or unlimited patience for friction-heavy authentication flows, or unlimited vigilance for suspicious communications arriving in an inbox that also contains legitimate communications that look identical. The discipline that psychological acceptability demands is the discipline of designing for the person who actually exists rather than the person the policy assumes. The person who exists is competent at their job, well-intentioned toward their organization, and operating under real constraints of time, attention, and cognitive capacity. They are not trying to undermine security. They're trying to do their work. When the secure path and the productive path diverge, they will take the productive path, not because they do not care about security, but because that is the rational thing to do given the options available to them. The question that this principle makes unavoidable is not how do we make people follow the policy. It is how do we design the environment so that following the secure path and doing their work are the same action. when biometric authentication means that a single touch logs them in, security and productivity converge. When a one-click report button means that flagging a suspicious email takes less time than deleting it, security and the path of least resistance converge. When a password manager means that every credential is stronger than anything they could remember while requiring no memory at all, security and cognitive ease converge. The controls that achieve that convergence do not require more compliance effort. They require better design effort, the harder, slower, more collaborative work of understanding how people actually work, where the friction actually lives, and what the bypass behavior is actually telling you about the system that created it. That work is never finished because people change, technology changes, the nature of the work changes, and the friction points that were solved last year reappear in new forms this year. Security is not a policy that can be issued and enforced into effect. It is a property of the design environment that either makes the secure path easy or makes it hard, and the designed environment is always your responsibility to improve. End of session. Psychological acceptability. Usability matters.